Hello and welcome to Everyone Still Hacked Off, the first in a regular series of podcasts looking at journalism and the British press. I'm Jackie Hames.
And I'm Steve Barnett.
And I suppose, Steve, we both exemplify Hacked Off as an organisation as it brings together people from across society, members of the general public who, like me, had no real awareness of these issues until they get sucked into a news story. There's people like lawyers, journalists, entertainers, politicians of all political colours, and of course, not to forget the good old academics. Steve, you were one of the original founders of Hacked Off, 14 years now, can you believe that? And could you just tell us what it was like in those first days and how it all came about?
Yeah, sometimes it feels like decades ago and sometimes it feels like yesterday. I think at some point in the future we should do a deep dive into the history, but just very briefly. I'm sure people will remember there was a great journalist at The Guardian called Nick Davis, who was finding out about all sorts of dodgy stuff that was going on in the press over the 1990s and 2000s, and they kept denying it. He kept putting stories out in The Guardian, and it was all very under the radar until 2011 big story broke about the murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler, and the fact that journalists, as you'll remember, Jackie, from the News of the World, had been hacking into her voicemails.
It was
And
so
then it suddenly,
shocking, wasn't it, Steve?
It was shocking. And that's what really broke it out, because the broadcast media started covering it and it became a big story. As a direct result of that, the government, David Cameron was Prime Minister, set up the Leveson inquiry. That was an inquiry into the culture and practices of the press under the very eminent then appeal court judge, Lord Justice Leveson. And he started taking evidence from multiple members of the public and celebrities from November 2011.
And then, of course, we had several months of watching the most extraordinary procession, got my teeth mixed up, of witnesses, A-list celebrities like Hugh Grant and Sienna Miller, senior politicians, including 3 former prime ministers, newspaper owners like Rupert Murdoch, editors, journalists, and then several people like me who'd just been the victims of press abuse or mistreatment as a result of particular cases.
Yeah, and even 1 or 2 academics. So I have to say, that's how you and I met, Jackie, and certainly the evidence that was given by ordinary people who had suffered at the hands of the press. We can sympathise with the celebrities, but people like the McCanns and those who were kind of involved in the 7/7 bombing, they were pretty harrowing stories of people who had just suffered from extraordinary events and suddenly found their lives being turned upside down even more, again, by the press. So, yes, there were plenty of headlines during the course of the evidence, more so, I have to say, generated by the celebs than by ordinary people. And I think perhaps in our next edition, we'll have a look at some of the highlights. But anyway, a year later, Leveson actually produced his report in November 2012.
Oh, I remember it very well, Steve. I actually stood at the front steps of the Elizabeth Centre, conference centre, actually delivering Hacked Off's response to all the surrounding reporters, which was a moment which will stay with me for many years. And I don't know about you, but I felt there was a momentum. I felt that there was a willingness to actually get this done, to finally, after 70, get some change and create a truly independent regulator for the press. But did you imagine that really we'd still be here 14 years later, still trying to get those recommendations implemented despite the promises that were subsequently made by politicians?
Well, I remember feeling the same kind of optimism, despite the fact that I'd been involved in that for decades. Really should have known better. You may remember that when David Cameron set up the inquiry, he promised the victims, and I think you were there at the time, that he would implement.
Promised me across a table.
You were in the room, absolutely. You were there, eye to eye, face to face. And he said to you and the other victims who'd gone to see him, he actually said, if it's not bonkers, we'll do it, in terms of Leveson's recommendations. So I read that report. I was sort of squirreled away with a few people who were allowed to read it before it was made public. It was clear that they were sensible, they were moderate, and I really did think that after 7 previous inquiries, after 70 years of trying to get something done, this was the moment. And then I remember that dramatic moment when Cameron stood up in Parliament later that day, the day the report was published, and said, actually, this was a step too far. I mean, he literally stood there and he parroted the newspaper nonsense about how these moderate proposals for self-regulation would threaten press freedom. Frankly, it was a shameful act of political cowardice because he just surrendered to the press lobby. But at that point, I'm afraid, going back to your original question, I did think, okay, here we go again. I was right to be cynical, and here we still are.
But we should emphasise that this issue of press accountability is just as relevant today, now, as it was 15 years ago. It isn't just an ancient history which the press would have us believe. There are still newspaper journalists doing some terrible things, breaking their own code of conduct with impunity, and it means that there are still people out there on the receiving end of press abuse who have no access to justice at all. And one of our aims as a campaigning group is to hear from these people and learn more about those stories, which we'll, of course, be trying to feature in these podcasts.
Yeah, and we should remember it's a very powerful industry that we're talking about, which can also do some great good and has done some great good. But on the other hand, as you said, Jackie, it continues to make and break its own rules while politicians cower in the corner. I know you've got a great example, Jackie. We're trying to be as current and contemporary as possible, and your example comes from just from the last few weeks.
Yeah, our listeners may be aware of the recent coverage relating to Millie Bobby Brown. A quick explainer for those unaware of this story: Millie is an actor who came to prominence when she was just 11 years old for appearing in the Netflix series Stranger Things, which turned her into a huge star. She's now 21 and been on a promotional tour for her new film, The Electric State, during which she was targeted by a mass of news stories and social media gossip, relentlessly criticising how she looks. Well, she bravely hit back. She wasn't going to stand for it, and she posted a video on Instagram saying that the media's focus on her appearance was harmful and unrealistic, especially since she's grown up in the public eye. Millie was particularly upset that some of the harsh comments actually came from other women and said that this wasn't journalism, it was actually bullying. This is a common theme from young actors, particularly women who've grown up in the public eye. And in fact, I remember it very clearly, as I'm sure you do, when we worked with Hacked Off supporter Charlotte Church a few years back. And she told a similar story of being hunted down and spied upon as by newspapers as she just grew up, like all of us had to do.
She did, and I think, this is why I think it's a wonderful example of how things that were said and evidence that was given to the Leveson inquiry is still relevant today. Charlotte Church gave some quite graphic evidence to the inquiry of the ordeals that she had to suffer at the hands of tabloid reporters. We've got a brief clip from that evidence here.
Generally, from 16 to 18, there was at least one photographer there most days. And by most days, maybe 5 out of 7 days in a week. If there was a story that had just broken or anything like that, then they would literally be there all the time, and there would be a lot of them. Maybe, 6 to 8, possibly. So it was really, really intense. And then, of course, when you get to a situation where if you're out in public, and they're trying to take photos, those are really indecent photos that they're trying to get because, at the time it was all the rage to take those photos and expose these celebrities for whatever it may be, their cellulite, I'm not really sure. But it was, once again, just a really unpleasant experience. And something I hope I don't really have to go through again.
So it seems like nothing has changed, Steve. Interestingly, though, in a twist this time, in a break from the usual editorial wall of silence, one of the women journalists called out by Millie Bobby Brown has now come forward. Initially hidden behind a female reporter byline, Lydia Hawken, the author of the What Has Millie Brown Done to Her Face article, has now resigned from the Daily Mail for, quote, the part I played in pushing the sexist, misogynistic narrative. And she said that since her her identity had been released. She'd experienced a flavour of what it's like for women targeted by this sort of coverage. Steve, she also made the point that she didn't feel brave enough to stand up to the editorial team at the Daily Mail when she was commissioned to write this article.
I know that some commentators following that story have suggested that she might complain to the body that the industry set up, IPSO, which is a complaints handler. They call it a regulator, but it's just a complaints handler run by the industry. Frankly, it's pretty useless. The industry appoints the chair, pays them the money. The industry sets up the rules and the structures of IPSO. They decide how it's going to be run. And frankly, it is no better than its discredited predecessor, the Press Complaints Commission, which it replaced. You'll remember the PCC, Jackie.
I do.
Which was also run by the industry. And in fact, at one point, they published a report about the whole phone hacking scandal in the mid-2000s about what was going on in the press, saying this is all a load of nonsense, nothing to see here. And you know who they blamed? They blamed The Guardian.
Of course
they actually blamed The Guardian for stirring up all this irresponsible nonsense. They said it's obviously Nick Davis who's got his knickers in a twist about something that's not really happening at all. So I think maybe in a later episode we'll go into a little bit more detail about IPSO, how they work, how they don't work, and what they do.
But going back to the Leveson inquiry into the culture and ethics of the press, we saw many tabloid journalists who'd examined their consciences about whether to speak out. And it was really quite inspiring to see how many of them really turned almost 180 degrees and were able to speak out and challenge, and some of them went to prison and some of them were fined. And you've been speaking to one of them that did.
Now, some of you may have come across a highly acclaimed film released last year called Kneecap. It told the story of an Irish hip-hop trio from Belfast who called themselves Kneecap and their rise from obscurity to a successful band who championed the Irish language. It's a riotous mixture of comedy, politics, drugs, sex and religion, with the three members of the group actually playing themselves. The film was written and directed by Rich Peppiatt and was nominated for 6 awards at this year's BAFTAs and won the award for Best New Director. And I'm delighted to say that Rich has joined us for this podcast for reasons that will become clear in a moment. Rich, thanks for coming on our very first show and many congrats. Let's talk about Kneecap in a moment. But listeners may not be aware that before your illustrious career as a filmmaker, you had a slightly less illustrious career as a journalist for the Red Top Daily Star. Tell us how you got into that and what you actually you thought you were getting into when you went there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting how life sort of takes its twists and turns. You know, my first career was out of university. I did my journalism training and NCTJ, and I think to me, I always wanted to write, and journalism felt like a way to get into writing and get paid for it, because it's there's a lot of ways you can write, be that scripts or books, and you've kind of got to do the work up front without really getting paid much, and I couldn't afford to do that. So I thought I'd get into journalism. I also I was dating a journalist at the time who worked at the Daily Express, and so I got a job at the Daily Star, and I never really set out to be a journalist, I don't think, and and it turned out I wasn't a particularly good one. I don't think I didn't really have the patience for it in many ways, and I think also I was living quite a chaotic life. It suited me working at the Daily Star at the time because it being quite a showbiz heavy paper, it involved a lot of going out in the evening and drinking and partying and sort of speaking to celebrities and getting tittle tattle and that to me sort of suited me fine, going out and drinking for a living. But for me, the problems came when some of those fast and loose rules of showbiz journalism started becoming more prevalent in the news pages of the Daily Star, and not just the Daily Star. I mean, right across Fleet Street, I started noticing how much there was this tendency of kind of concocting quotes and twisting the truth to fit certain narratives. And when that came to stuff at the time, there was the English Defence League on the rise in the UK, and it felt like certainly the Daily Star in particular, but also other papers were really promoting them, it felt to me, and in terms of denigrating and demonising the Muslim population of Britain, that felt that was very prevalent as well. And I think that was when my conscience started sort of really twanging on me that I couldn't be part of this. And I quit very publicly, leaked my resignation letter to The Guardian, and it became, I guess, a bit of a cause celeb at the time. And then the Leveson inquiry came along. And
hang on, before you get onto that, Rick, just before you get onto that, I'm just interested in the kinds of things that you were asked to do or maybe told to do at the Daily Star, which you found after a certain amount of time was just unconscionable. I mean, can you give us an idea of the kinds of things that you were being told to do in the name of journalism?
Well, I always remember there being a story where there was a family of asylum seekers from Sudan, if I remember rightly, who were being housed in a place in Chelsea, and it was, this story was basically, asylum seekers put up in £0.2 million townhouse, right? It was basically what it was. And so myself and every other newspaper on Fleet Street was sent down to this house to go and basically doorstep them and try and get a quote, from someone in the house to sort of say, how do you feel about, living in this lavish, property while, people are born here, can't get housing, sort of thing. But the family inside were obviously quite intimidated, by all these people hanging around outside the house. And the day went on and no one came out. And eventually I thought, right, I want to knock this on the head, and spoke to the other journalists, and they said they were going to do similarly. And then the next morning I turned up at the office to see the newspapers, and every one of them had the same quote, which was from the father, sort of saying, I don't care, I'll take what I can get. And I called up one of the journalists being like, what the hell happened? He never came out all day. And they were very kind of furtive about that. And the news editor at the time at the Daily Star came up to me and said, what happened? Really angry. And I said, they never came out. This quote's just made up. And he said, you need to be more canny. You need to understand, you need to be more canny.
More canny as in just, if other people are making stuff up, you can make stuff up.
Basically, yeah, you need to, if everyone else is doing it, you should have been part of that conversation to kind of, get the quote as well, to all agree on a quote. And that was one of those things that really just went, this isn't journalism, right? This is something else entirely. And that one always sticks with me, that phrase, you need to be more canny, which was often how it happened, is people wouldn't necessarily tell you directly to do something unethical, but they would put you in a position where the only way to get something done was to be unethical.
But this wasn't,
right?
I mean, I think your point was this wasn't a one-off. That was part of the culture.
No, that was part of the culture. And but that's not to say, this is the thing, is that most journalists I know are decent people and often have politics which would, are not in line with the publications they work for. And I think the majority of journalists, I would say, are quite liberal in their politics, but the majority of publications are quite right-wing in their politics. And so what you have is a lot of people who want to work in the industry. It's a very competitive industry to get into, and who feel they need to kind of leave their beliefs at the door in order to get on in that career. And sometimes it becomes more than just, parking your own politics, and it strays into really actively promoting a different type of politics than you believe. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think that that hasn't changed a lot, really, from as far as I can see from when I worked there, which was, over 15 odd years ago now. It hasn't changed a lot.
And there are still journalists, presumably, who are put under pressure to not necessarily invent things, but tweak things, exaggerate.
Well, I mean, I was only reading the other day, there was a journalist at the Mail Online who resigned because she was made to write a nasty article about...
Yeah, we've just talked about her, yep.
Really, some celebrity or other, I can't remember, but...
Millie Bobby Brown, yeah.
Right, there you go, Millie Bobby Brown. So, that I imagine was very difficult for her. I could literally, when I read that story, I could see what had happened. Do you know what I mean? She personally, did not want to write an article in a certain way, did not agree with the salacious nature of it, or the woman shaming nature of it. But what you're supposed to do in that circumstance as an individual journalist without power, when you're told to do something,
yeah,
you're put in a very difficult position. And I felt that pressure many, many times, and eventually I snapped. And obviously she did, and there's been many journalists along the way. Maybe haven't done so publicly, but have left the industry because they found that pressure day in, day out too much to bear. Whilst others, they find peace with it, they come to terms with it, and as I said, I don't necessarily feel that on an individual level I criticise individual journalists, because everyone has their decisions to make and mortgages to pay and all of that. And I know, some people make a decision that they will do things that they don't really want to do because they have a family to support. And I don't think that's necessarily, I don't necessarily think that that's makes them bad people. It just means they're put in a position that they have to make a tough choice. What I do think is open to criticism is the structural problems within the newspaper industry that don't have the checks and balances, don't have the ethical concerns from top down that prevent those sort of pressures occurring. And if they do, weed out the bad apples.
It's interesting because what you're talking about is some kind of protection for journalists who want to follow an ethical code and just get swept along by the industry or by their editors telling them what to do. Rather than there's obviously protection for people who are on the receiving end of press abuse.
Well, look, and in a way, there should be, and the National Union of Journalists exists and things like that. But I certainly don't, I don't feel that ever went far enough, or that the NUJ felt empowered enough. Some of the journalists who would have been problematic, would like to say, were members of the NUJ.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? So sometimes you might be complaining about a person who was part of that organisation.
Yeah.
Because they've got if they're a journalist, they've got every right to be there as much as anyone else. So, it didn't feel necessarily to me. I mean, I think that the Express Group, what the Daily Star was part of, I think the NUJ wasn't at its strongest there. I don't think it ever had a strong presence. But, the NUJ does as best as it can. But it's certainly, I think that just with the ethical failures that have occurred in the industry, as we all know, in the last 20, 25 years, clearly hasn't been enough to kind of manage that situation.
What, just going back to Leveson, and you gave evidence, which was very powerful stuff, and talked about some of the stories you've just been mentioning. But then after that, because you'd quit, you started your illustrious filmmaking career with a film called One Rogue Reporter.
Well, yeah, I mean, I having left journalism, not really much of a plan of what I was going to do. Someone said, would you think about doing a stand-up comedy show at the Edinburgh Fringe? And I decided, that sounds, like would be quite fun. So I did, and it went quite well. And then I toured the show, and then I had the idea of turning that show into a documentary. And really, the premise of both the show and the documentary was that to test the limits of privacy and public interest and freedom of expression by turning the tables on tabloid newspaper editors and basically seeing how they liked to up them, right? By delving into their private lives and, kind of really doorstepping them, getting in their face, and doing all the things that they sent reporters out to do on a daily basis. And, it ended up on Netflix, and it was, for a lo-fi kind of budget documentary, did quite well.
Okay, before we go, I've got to talk about Kneecap, which is a fabulous story. It's a great film. Just tell us how you got into it. I mean, it's for anyone who's not seen it, you really got to see it, because it's a wonderful piece of work. How did you get into the idea of an Irish rap band and making a film about it?
Well, I live in Belfast now, and I just went to one of their gigs, just as a fan of hip-hop. I went to one of their gigs and was just blown away by them and their energy and stage presence and their sort of, real raucous politics that they have. And I just thought, there's something about these guys that I think that they go in places, and they were so controversial, and it all really appealed to me. And then when I finally sat down with them and had a pint, I realised that we were all very aligned in being troublemakers and enjoying upsetting the people in power. And they'd actually all seen One Rogue Reporter, and they
were you surprised that they'd seen it?
Well, I'd only watched it once. I'd got in touch with them, and they'd looked me
I
up
see.
and gone,
Okay.
"We better watch this." But yeah, they hadn't watched it, but by the time I met up with them, they said they'd done their homework and watched it, and they really enjoyed it. So I think that really helped sort of convince them that I was the man to make their film. And yeah, it took 5 years to make overall to sort of pull it all together, and we're obviously very very blown away by the success of it. And when you set out to make a film that's in the Irish language about a rap group that barely anyone has spoken or heard of, you don't expect it to be shortlisted for an Oscar and win a BAFTA and 7 Biffers, whatever it won. But we had a fantastic run.
Rich, thanks very much. It's been great talking to you, filmmaker, former journalist and troublemaker. And
lovely speaking to you, Steve.
Hope to get you back on soon. Cheers, mate.
Cheers.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. And of course, I know Rich and saw his One Rogue Reporter film, which was unbelievable and exemplified the behaviour of so many news editors. It takes a lot of courage, Steve, doesn't it, to stand up and say and do what he did?
It does. I mean, he and the male journalist that you talked about earlier clearly are exceptional, and I raise my hat to both of them. And there are others who have been involved in the campaign, of course, who as you said before. And I think at some point we should get some of them on the programme as well, who have risked their careers, have come out and said what we were doing was wrong. Now, Rich has ended up being a successful film director, and it's worked out very well for him. There are many young journalists out there who neither aspire to nor possibly would be able to end up as a very successful film director. And it's much more difficult because if you think about it, you are ambitious, you really want to be a journalist. Maybe you've been inspired by one of the films that we've been talking about, some of the more recent films, which highlights the great work that journalists can do, and yet you find yourself trapped in this sort of fairly toxic newsroom culture. And not many people, I'm afraid, have not just the courage but also the wherewithal. Maybe you've got a mortgage, maybe you've got kids, and it's not that easy just to take a step aside and to say, actually, this is wrong.
Well, we'll certainly be championing the future Woodward and Bernsteins on this podcast because we're all passionate believers in independent and ethical investigative journalism. Well, Steve, that's gone quickly. Our first edition almost in the bag. Just before we go, looking at the headlines even today, covering the updated Brexit agreement, it kind of epitomises everything we've been discussing today, Steve. Does it remind you of anything?
It's the referendum all over again. We'll go back to it in a future episode.
Already.
I know. We'll go back to it. This whole question of the press and accuracy, which is supposed to be an integral part of their code of conduct. But here's 3 headlines from you just from today. The Sun. Done up like a kipper. Starmer agrees to take rules from Brussels. Bow down to EU judges. Pay billions for privilege. Let's have a look at the Mail. Starmer's surrender in big, bold, black letters. And the Daily Telegraph inevitably kiss goodbye to Brexit, where you've got Keir Starmer kissing the EU Commissioner on the sort of big front page picture. So we're kind of we will go back and talk about the press's, let's say, strained relationship with the truth in future episodes. But I think here is a great example of how things haven't changed.
Yes, exactly. And I think it might be worth us doing a bit of a special on Brexit and the run up to it. And we have some beautiful, brilliant examples of how the drip feeding of misinformation over many years has perhaps made that whole dialogue around Brexit so toxic. But we would, of course, love your feedback and ideas as to what you think you'd like us to cover and any questions or personal experiences. I think one of the reasons we exist is that so many people feel they don't have a voice when it comes to challenging these powerful media companies. And part of our mission is to give listeners, to give you that voice.
Yep. So if you want to give us any kind of feedback, negative as well as positive, our website is Hacking Inquiry. That's hacking, HACKING, and then inquiry with an INQUIRY, all one word, hackinginquiry.org. Or you can email us on campaign@hackinginquiry.org, as I've just spelt it, and we'll put that in our show notes along with any other clips and quotes that we've been referring to during the podcast.
So thank you everyone for listening. Please do join us in subsequent episodes. We'll be really encouraged by your responses, and we will of course respond to any questions you have. So thanks for listening, and it's a bye from me.
And it's a bye from me.